This time it's part 1 of our Triumph Buyer's Guide, and in this part we're going to be dealing with pre-war motorcycles, in other words anything up to and including World War II. Before we start, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content. So the story of Triumph dates all the way back to the 1880s, when one Siegfried Beckmann, a German immigrant, set up a company exporting bicycles into Europe. After a while he established his own production company and would later move to Coventry area, where he would begin mass production of bicycles and later of course motorcycles. They built the first machines in around 1902 to 1903, variously fitted with Minerva or Jap GA Prestwick engines, and it really wasn't until 1905 when things really started to move for Triumph. This is the year they introduced their first own-built engine. This was a 363 side valve. Of course at this point it was direct drive, there was a belt drive to the back wheel, it was essentially a bicycle chassis, and there was no gearbox, and no clutch for that matter either, and the controls are very different from what we'd recognise today. Quite early on in the years leading to around 1910, we see the introduction of the free wheel. This is essentially a clutch built into the wheel hub. There are also some machines available with a selection of about 3 gears also built into the wheel hub, and these are usually built by Sterny Archer. These systems are reasonably effective, although obviously not terribly robust. I've ridden one of the machines with a free clutch. They're not exactly very precise. It's a metal on metal clutch, it's not very hard wear and it very quickly heats up. Certainly if you're looking for a very early Triumph, a machine with a clutch is obviously a little bit easier to deal with in modern traffic. In these veteran era machines, Triumph gradually increased the capacity of their engine, going from the initial 363 up through stages to 500cc and eventually to the full-on 550, which is probably the most famous capacity for these early Triumph side valvers. By the time we get into World War I, we're dealing with perhaps the most famous early Triumph model, and that's the Model H. The Model H is an excellent model, though it still tends to use the fore and aft suspension linkage at the front, which is extremely crude, has very poor brakes, but it does have a transmission system, a proper countershaft gearbox, although final drive is still belt drive. These machines are of course, like anything related to war period, if it's got some sort of history where it proving it was actually used during the war, that's automatically going to make it more expensive. So perhaps a better choice if you're going for a very early machine is something from the 1920s. After all, a 1920s bike will have a gearbox, will feature a number of refinements that have moved it on for the Model H, and it will probably be slightly cheaper because it won't be associated with World War I use. A really good choice at this point is the post-war follow-up to the Model H, or the trusty Triumph, and that's the Model SD. These bikes employ essentially the same 550 engine with a 3-speed countershaft gearbox, and are generally that little bit more refined than the H was, although the brakes are still pretty terrible. Probably the most famous 1920s bike would be the Ricky. This was the first 4-valve production motorcycle, as far as I'm aware, produced anywhere in the world. Sometimes called the Type R, this machine was used at the TT, although not particularly successfully. Essentially a TT replica then followed on, despite the fact the machine wasn't actually that successful at the 21TT. The machine was a reasonably good seller, but it was pricey because of that complex 4-valve engine. And of course that makes it then a very expensive buy today. If you can get one for reasonable money, I think you'll be doing very well. For those on a budget, a better choice of 1920s machine is going to be something like the Type LW Junior. This was a 225 two-stroke machine, which was produced in very big numbers, so is reasonably common still even today. And they still make a great usable little bike, because at the end of the day when you've got a veteran era machine, you're not going to be thrashing it round at 50-60 miles an hour. An even better choice though is the Model P. The Model P was designed to drastically undercut all the competition, and this used again a 550 side valve engine, but cut a number of corners and made a number of changes to make the machine much cheaper to produce, and it massively undercut the vast majority of motorcycle producers at that time, and did send a number of people into bankruptcy. And it's easy to understand why. The Model P initially had some production issues because there was some skimping with the engine. But once these were resolved, the Triumph did become a very dependable member of the range, and the Model P would remain successful for a number of years, and is probably the machine that in many ways built Triumph, because it was a machine that was affordable to a great number of people, and not just the landed gentry, which an awful lot of early machines of course had been. Essentially this was the machine that opened up Triumph to the wider world. Now the end of the 20s would see the introduction of the saddle tank. Oddly enough, these saddle tank models aren't quite as popular as some of the earlier flat tankers, and can often be picked up for reasonable prices. And there's a very broad range of machines available at that point, right from a 277cc side valver, the Model WS, all the way up to the 550 NSD, which is a later development of the earlier flat tank side valvers. But there were also a new range of overhead valve 2-valve engines. These engines were developed by Victor Horseman and replaced the Ricky engines. They had better performance, but also more importantly, they were also much cheaper to produce because they were much more straightforward engines. And these engines would stay pretty much as is throughout the late 20s and into the early and mid 30s. So realistically, any machine from the late 20s to the very early 30s, because they're not seen as the more favoured machines amongst Triumph aficionados, can make a really sensible buy, particularly when you're looking at the side valvers from 350 upwards to 500 and 550. The overhead valve engines of course will go for a higher price, but they still don't quite hit the value of the later 1930s machines or the earlier flat tank machines such as the Ricky. Now of course the early 30s was a very tough period in the motorcycle industry, and it was equally tough for Triumph. They'd spent an awful lot of money investing in the production of motor cars, which didn't leave a lot of capital to develop new models. So machines like the Victor Horseman developed overhead valve bikes and the similar side valves remained in production for longer than perhaps they should have done. As a consequence, by the early to mid 30s, the Triumph machines were starting to look rather outdated, and the company was in trouble. Or more specifically, the car company was in trouble. To help prop the car company up, Triumph Motorcycles was sold off, and it was purchased by Jack Sangster. Sangster purchased Ariel in 32 and made a pretty good job of getting that company up and running properly. He moved Val Page as chief designer at Ariel over from Ariel to Triumph to develop a completely new range of machines, with new styling, new chassis and above all new engines. The familiar side valves were still there in 350 and 550 capacities, of course a Triumph regular, but they were now joined by a new range of overhead valve engines from 250, where oddly enough there were two different versions of a 250, but there were also 350s and 500s. And at each capacity you also found that there was a range of sporting, race and more humdrum modest commuter versions. Now of course, when anybody thinks of 1930s or particularly later 30s Triumphs, we tend to think about the Speed Twin. This machine was introduced in 1938 and was an instant sales success. It was designed by Edward Turner, but was not actually the first parallel twin produced by Triumph. Val Page had introduced the 6.1 in 1932. This was quite a different machine. It ran a single camshaft rather than dual camshafts that the Speed Twin had. This single camshaft ran at the back of the engine, so in a lot of ways the engine layout was much more similar to that of say an A10 or later BSA engine than of the subsequent Triumph motorcycles. Now when it comes to purchasing 1930s Triumphs, pretty much everybody wants a Speed Twin, and the even rarer Tiger 100 Sporty model. But of course these bikes were only produced between 1938 and 1939. But the fact is the rarity of these machines also means that they're going to be very expensive. If you really like the Tiger styling, the singles are much more plentiful. Now when Turner first arrived, he introduced a range of sporty singles which he called the Tigers. These were the Tiger 70 250, the Tiger 80 350 and the Tiger 90, which was a 500cc single. These machines had beautiful styling with silver paintwork and chrome tanks. And these machines are fairly desirable, but much less so than the Speed Twin, so they can make a very sensible buy. And they are reasonably plentiful. An even wiser move would be to look for a Val Page machine, or for the less sporty based machines from either the Page or the Turner era. These are all essentially of course Val Page singles, and they're all excellent. Whether it's the 350 or 550 side valves, such as the humble 3.1 or 5.1, or whether it's the more sporty machines such as the 250L 2.1 or 2.1 250s. A machine such as the top performing 5.5 of the Val Page era is often overlooked when compared to the later Turner Tigers, although it is in many ways the same machine, it's just not quite as stylish. But again, this makes it a very sensible buy. But it's the cookie models that probably make the most sensible buy if you're on a budget. So as usual, it's the side valves that are the most affordable, although the Page overhead valve machines often are sold at fairly reasonable prices when compared to the later, if slightly more stylish Tigers. However, if you're really on a budget, then you may be looking at something even smaller. Now in 1933, tax laws made it a really good idea to have a 150cc lightweight machine in your range. Now initially Triumph built a machine which used a Villiers engine. They would later introduce the X051 and X055. These used a tiny little 150cc overhead valve engine, and in some ways can be seen as the 1930s version of the Tiger Cub. And if you can find one of these machines, they make a really affordable way onto Triumph 1930s ownership. Just don't expect them to be fast. So if I was looking for a 1930s or even earlier Triumph, what would I go for? For me, I'd probably avoid the glamorous. From the Turner era, machines like the 5H or the 3H overhead valve 350 and 500 singles can make a very good buy. Alternatively, and perhaps even more affordably, I would look at the Val Page era motorcycles. Any of the 250s, 350s or 500s, overhead valve or side valve would make excellent machines. Obviously if you're looking for something with a bit more performance, then you're going to be looking for an overhead valve engine. Now that being said, Triumph was famed for its excellent side valve machines of 350 and 550 capacities, and these can be really good bikes, if you're not too performance orientated that is, and more importantly if you're a canny buyer, they're that little bit cheaper. The side valves of course ran all the way up to World War II, but they didn't survive from the other side, as it was pretty much overhead valves only from that point onwards. Now of course we move into World War II, and of course Triumph was developing the 3TW. This was an overhead valve parallel twin 350 machine designed for military use. The Coventry Blitz put an end to that machine, having completely destroyed the factory and all but a handful of the pre-production prototypes that were there. Triumph would famously then move to a site in Warwick and then onto another site which would later be the Meriden factory. Here they would produce the 3HW. It's a single cylinder overhead valve 350 in use by the British military throughout the war. So there's quite a lot of them around. Again, any machine that's got provenance, which proves that it took part in World War II, is going to be a little bit more pricey than one that doesn't. It's also worth remembering that the 3H was in production for a small period at least after World War II, and was their only large capacity single that Triumph would produce, and it's these models that make a very good post-war buy. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, and that's all for the next video. I do hope you found this video useful. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.